Hello and welcome everyone to the seventh session of our Realities of Inequity series, where we examine the many obstacles faced by hardworking people in our region. Our previous sessions, as some of you know, have focused on issues like affordable childcare, digital access, such a big issue, mental health, public policies that are affecting working people, and housing costs, which are, as you'll learn today, an incredible challenge, incredible issue for so many in our region. As we look at this next slide, let me begin by defining ALICE for you. ALICE stands for those who are asset limited, income constrained, but they're employed. Those who are working, often at maybe 1, 2, or more jobs, but who just can't make ends meet, who can't afford our state's high costs of living. And so we all know, and we may interact with people who fit the ALICE profile, right? I'm talking about folks like cashiers, clerks, healthcare aides, security and cleaning staff, people we interact with every single day. They're the people we depend on, like grocery store workers, of course, childcare providers and delivery drivers. The pandemic has really shown us that these people are essential, right, to maintaining the operations that allow us to navigate our lives with ease, but they actually can't afford the essentials, things we often take for granted, like housing and food and healthcare and childcare, or the technology that today's world absolutely demands. And so every 2 years, we issue a report with other Maryland United Ways in the state that focus in on the ALICE population. As we look at this next slide, this report is made possible by our partner, Kaiser Permanente, and many other organizations. And we really thank them so very much for their generosity and for their ongoing support of this really vital tool. And so now this is an unsettling statistic from the report. A staggering 39% of Maryland households simply can't make ends meet. And this was before the pandemic. So you ask why? Because the cost of living far outpaces what they earn. Even with the recent minimum wage increase, even with stimulus checks coming, low wage earners still face significant challenges. As we see on this next slide, today we're going to focus on housing. It's the biggest expense for ALICE households, with families paying on average $1,500 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment in our region. And as you can see on this slide, 7 out of 10 families actually they can literally be in a situation where they can't find a home that they can afford, right? There simply aren't enough affordable places for hardworking people to live in the state of Maryland. So you're going to hear more numbers and more stats today from our presenters and panelists, some good, some bad, about the state of housing here in our region. But I want you to remember this. Behind each of these numbers, behind each of these stats is a person, someone who is fighting with all they've got to juggle the bills, to keep a roof over their head and food on the table, to just keep their family safe and healthy. And so United Way fights for every single one of them every day. And so now I'd like to share just a quick video about how we actually do that. Let's go ahead and play the video.
In the greater Baltimore area, the housing situation is dire. Even before COVID came on the scene, only 3 in 10 low-income renters could afford housing units. And now that COVID's happened, families have fewer assets and more are pushed to the brink of homelessness. United Way is working on a whole range of interventions to the current housing crisis. Secure housing is so unattainable these days because wages have not kept pace with the rising costs of living. Complex problems require multifaceted solutions. A lot of these families have faced intergenerational poverty or structural racism, and if folks don't have resources to turn to or community members that they can lean on when times get tough, it's really hard for them to stay afloat at all times. The pandemic has meant that when folks have lost their income, they rely on their savings or other assets like credit. Now, they're tapped out. They're much more quickly pushed to the brink of homelessness. So if you think about a family, just being safe is the starting point for children to be able to grow and be able to learn and be able to blossom. Families who don't have homes, children don't have a place where they can do their homework, families don't have a place where they can eat, families don't have a place where they can do clothes. If they're not feeling safe, they can't sleep properly. So homelessness can be both a cause of unemployment or caused by unemployment. Everything begins to spiral out of control. United Way has a whole portfolio of housing services that can assist families. So for example, our Family Stability Program is an evidence-based national best practice model that links eviction prevention services with case management services. And our case managers link these families to ongoing supports and address that self-sufficiency piece. So we stop the crisis and we plan for the long term. It's been said that families can really only afford 30% of their income to go to their rent. And so if a family has to pay more than 30% of their income, they're gonna have to start making tough choices elsewhere, make cuts in their budget somewhere so that they can afford that rent that's out of their range. And this is why we see significant differences in life expectancy between some neighborhoods in Baltimore, for example, having a 79-year life expectancy and some neighborhoods having a 64-year life expectancy. An example of one of our innovative programs is our rent forgiveness pilot, where we ask tenants to pay 1/3 of the rent that they owe, landlords will forgive 1/3, and United Way has raised funds from private foundations to pay for the other third. So this spreads out the difficulties caused by the COVID crisis across 3 different parties. We have a new program in Baltimore County called the STEP program, which stands for Strategic Targeted Eviction Prevention. Rather than waiting for those households to come seek services, we go to them and say that we realize that you're in need and we're gonna help you in advance and work with your landlord to pay your back rent before you even ask for assistance. United Way of Central Maryland is always looking to expand best practices from other communities and take the learnings of either other United Ways or other innovators and thought leaders and pilot them here in the Central Maryland region. And we ourselves are major innovators. So for example, our STEP program is something that we invented in consultation with government, landlords, the private sector, donors, and other United Ways across the country to bring together an innovative new program that really is going to help thousands of folks stay in their homes. I love working at United Way, and I love the work that we do. And so we're really good at taking what's needed and moving it to where it's needed. Instead of prescribing what a family needs, we work with families on their own goals and aspirations, and we try to bring together all of the ingredients that they need to live their best lives.
Thank you so very much for that wonderful video. We're working hard to keep people in their homes, right? And just so I'm appreciative of the person that I'll introduce to you is Dr. Scott Gobreth, who's the Associate Vice President of Homeless Services for United Way of Central Maryland. He's been doing a great job, and he will moderate today's session. Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Franklin. And it is so great to see so many people in attendance at today's session as we drill down on this incredibly important issue of the evictions crisis we're facing today. Here's the situation in brief. The pandemic has caused millions of people to lose their incomes, and many of those have still not gotten back to work. When people have no income, they can't pay their bills, and the biggest bill that people have to pay is usually rent. Consequently, millions of households are behind on rent and will soon face eviction. Advocates have been sounding the warning sirens for months, but public and media attention to this issue have faded. In part, this is because the courts have closed for the past 5 months due to the winter COVID spike. But now courts are reopening and evictions are resuming. There is supposedly a nationwide moratorium on evictions put in place by the CDC, but in practice, there are loopholes and many people are going to be evicted even before that moratorium ends on June 30th. Another important factor to consider is that while moratoria on evictions do keep people in their homes, they do not address the fact that people still owe the monthly rent. Many households now owe more than a year of back rent, and that can be somewhere in the range of $10,000 to $20,000 at this point. Some households will be able to figure something out, but many others are going to slip into homelessness if something cannot be done. And that's the crisis in a nutshell that we're here to talk about today. We've assembled a fantastic panel of experts who are right in the middle of this crisis, trying to keep people in their homes. Let's take a moment to meet our panelists, and I'll ask each of them a warm-up question to get us started. Namely, what is a number that you want people to know about that relates to the COVID housing crisis? So for example, my number is 13. There have been 13 first days of the month since the pandemic began, meaning that someone who lost their job due to layoffs or due to having to stay home with school children might owe as much as 13 months of rent now. First off, we have Angela Whitaker. Angela is the Director of Baltimore City Community Action Partnership in the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success. Angela's office has been handling the vast majority of eviction prevention efforts in Baltimore City. Angela, welcome. What's the number you want people to know?
Hi, Scott. My number is 8,406, and that's the number of applications that we've received from tenants seeking rental assistance since November. So in just 4 short months, we have received applications from over 8,000 people saying that they are in danger of being evicted.
Wow, that is a huge number. And if that's a huge number, thanks for sharing that. Next up, we have Zafar Shah. Zafar is a housing attorney at the Public Justice Center. Zafar is also a policy expert who's been essential to debates in our state's capital about housing policy. Zafar, welcome. What's a number you want people to know?
My number is 24,000, which is the average number of eviction cases filed per month in the district courts of Maryland in November, December, January, and February. So there's a lot going on with eviction cases, and that number, I think, kind of puts a figure to that.
Wow. Again, a very telling number. Thanks, Zafar. Next up, we have Terry Hickey. Terry is the Deputy Director of the Office of Housing and Community Development at the Baltimore County Department of Health and Human Services. Terry is one of the most important government leaders working to address the pandemic housing crisis in Baltimore County. Welcome, Terry. What's your number?
Thanks for having me, Scott. So I thought about this a lot, and my number is 335. That represents the number of households in the first 1,600 applicants we screened that were denied rental assistance because of a failure to respond. It sounds like a downer number, but the reason I bring it up now is because when we started calling those folks that had been non-responsive, we realized the depth of trauma and fear and suspicion that was out there that was preventing people from reaching out for help. And I think we really have to keep that in mind as we design our programs.
Absolutely, great number. A lot of folks are in their turtle shell right now. They don't want to answer the phone. They don't want to answer the mail. They know it's going to be bad news and they don't want to respond, and that makes it hard for them to access them. Last but not least, we have Jessie Keller. Jessie is a government and community affairs manager at the Maryland Multi-Housing Association. Her organization brings together property managers for collective action, and Jessie has been crucial to bringing landlords into conversations across the state about how to address the evictions crisis. Jessie, what's the number you want people to know?
Hi, good afternoon. The number I would like everyone to know is 35.062, and that is the average percentage for delinquency rates at mid-month of those living in low-income communities that are not subsidized with government tax credits. So since the pandemic, around 35% of residents in low-income communities have been delinquent each month at mid-month.
Wow. So a third of poor renters are behind on rent. Those are some great data points to kick us off, but I also want to bring back in the human element for just a moment. We have been getting a lot of panicked calls at our 211 Maryland helpline from people who are unable to pay their rent. 211 has been an essential resource for people during COVID, and it acts like a barometer of need in the region. We've assembled a montage of calls so that you can hear some of what we're hearing and how desperate the situation is becoming. Please note that the voices of the callers you're about to hear have been changed to protect their anonymity.
Give me one moment, Scott. We're having just a little bit of technical difficulty. I'll get the video up momentarily.
Okay, sure. So, one of the things that we are constantly trying to figure out is targeted strategies for getting assistance to folks. And that's one of the things that we're going to hear about shortly is how do we get assistance to the most vulnerable? And that's one of the things to keep in mind. Are we ready for the video?
For some reason, it's not showing up in my share. So keep let you know when I'm able to.
There we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
211 Maryland, this is Valerie. May I help you?
I'm currently in danger of being homeless. I'm calling because I needed some assistance with my rent.
I have past due balance due for my rent.
I'm in a panic, and I have rent coming up, and I'm worried. I just don't know what to do because I've been reading the new stimulus that's coming out. I'm self-employed PUA, so they said that there's no more, I'd have to like refile or something, but I don't know what to do.
I was trying to see if I could get some information on some programs perhaps that could help me with that.
I'm calling because it said for rental help to dial 211, so that's what I was calling for.
Are there any resources or programs that you know of that could help me pay rent?
You know, so I knew if I got behind in my rent that I would be so far that it would be like a kick out situation. And I've never been late. I'm a good tenant. 6 years I've been here, and I was just like trying to get help through. I don't know.
I had to like sell, you know, my stuff and my kids' stuff to try to make ends meet. And so it's, you know, when I get $50, I have to see like, okay, should I pay
food,
the $50 for the light, or should I pay the $50 for the rent? But then I pay $50, and then by the time the bill's due, it has like another late fee, and then it's like I never pay them the $50. So it's like, you know, I have to like battle and feel like, oh, what's more important this month, like me keeping my light, or, you know, like, you know, paying it towards my rent or my car insurance.
It's okay. You know, this is something that, you know, I don't think anyone could have prepared. You know, you can't fathom this, you know?
Yeah, sure. So we're an information referral service, so I'll have to give you a couple of different numbers that I think could help you out with the rent.
There are programs that are helping some with back rent that, you know, there may be assistance available to you. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate your help.
You're welcome. Take care of yourself, okay? All right. You're welcome. Bye-bye.
You all have been so kind and so helpful. I've called you many times. And so, and you really have. That's not just hey, can you help me more? You really have. And I want you to know it matters.
You take care, and you call us back if you need to, okay?
Wow, that was really moving. I get choked up every time I hear clips of that video, and that's the actual voices of callers that are calling 211 in need of assistance right now. So you get a sense of the scale of the crisis. Do any of the panelists have anything they want to say about in reaction to the video that we just saw? It's okay.
Scott, I'll just say 3 quick things. You can't substitute human contact. We have to remember that throughout this. People talking to people are where it's going to start. Never assume that people have the information we think they should have, and constantly keep pushing out more. And then just keep removing barriers. Folks have enough trouble asking for help in the first place. They can't jump through so many hoops.
Great. And, you know, that's something I want to return to later on in the panel is cutting out the red tape, reducing the barriers. How do we get the money moving? The money's out there. You know, we need to get it to people, and we need to help now. So we've shared some salient statistics already about from each of the panelists. I want to put a few more up on the screen so we can orient our conversation. The first slide I want to point out is that 1 in 7 Americans are not caught up on rent. That number varies from region to region, but across the country, it's 1 in 7. And what's important to note about the slide in front of you right now is that rent delinquency is unequally distributed across different racial and ethnic groups. So for white households, 9% are behind on rent, but 22% of Black households are behind on rent. And that's more than double the number of white households. And there's similarly high percentages among Asian and Latinx households. The major reason for this disparity is that households of color were on average poorer to begin with before COVID, and they've been pushed to the brink of homelessness much more quickly than white households as a result of the pandemic housing crisis. The next data point I want to put up is 6.7%. These are all other numbers I could have provided at the start. 6.7% is the Maryland unemployment rate. That's the equivalent of 313,000 filers. For scale, that's about half the population of Baltimore City spread out throughout the state. Today's unemployment rate in Maryland is down considerably from the peak of 10.1% in April, but is still nearly double the pre-pandemic unemployment rate. So in other words, the Maryland economy is improving, but we still have a long way to go. The last slide I want to highlight is how more and more renters are falling behind. The blue line in the graph before you represents rent delinquency mid-month, and the orange line represents rent delinquency at the end of the month. And this is across Maryland. What this tells me is that renters are trying to pay their rent, but they're struggling to do so at the start of the month. It's taking longer to pull their funds together and balance their resources. You'll notice also that there were spikes in October when unemployment assistance ended and the gridlock in Congress wasn't able to pass anything. And there's been a decline since January when the stimulus finally passed, unemployment assistance came back on, and new rental assistance funds have started coming online. So there are signs of optimism. The economy is slowly coming back online. The vaccines are getting out. The sun is shining. A single party controls the federal government, and that means they can pass legislation in contrast to the gridlock that characterized most of 2020. But with everything reopening, there is now the expectation that it's time for people to start paying their rent again, including the back rent that they owe, or they will soon face eviction. And so the eviction tsunami is about to make landfall. Let's hear from our experts and get their perspective on where we're at in this crisis, what to expect in the near future, and what to do about it. First question to you, Jesse, and then I'll ask Angela to comment. Please talk about the scale of the crisis from your perspective. Why should we be concerned and who is most affected? Jesse?
Thank you, Scott. So as I mentioned, since the beginning of the crisis, we have been surveying our members who are owners and managers of rental properties. Out of our 205,000 rental units across the state, we've been receiving data from approximately half of those. And prior to COVID, Maryland had a very strong rental market with low vacancy rates and delinquency rates around 10%. And since the pandemic, we have seen those rates, delinquency rates skyrocket at mid-month between 20 and 30%. And as Scott mentioned, from the pandemic creep up from historic lows, the historic average of around 10% all the way up to it's near 18% by the end of the month. And after a few months in June, we started to break our data out by asset class. And for those of you who don't know, the apartment industry uses terminology for asset classes to identify communities and their quality and cost. So for example, an A-class apartment building is the brand new apartment with luxury amenities, while the C-class communities are often those over 40 years old in maybe more affordable areas. And with the C-class communities, as I mentioned, the delinquency rates for those communities have been an average of 35% a month at mid-month. And so this shows that the crisis is severely impacting our lower income residents, our residents who probably couldn't afford to stay home during COVID, who are still working, who are living in smaller living conditions compared to those who can properly social distance. And while these numbers are extremely alarming and convey a crisis like we've never had one before, we are able to show that these communities and apartments are where the money, the eviction prevention funds need to go to. And so working to identify those people most effective, we're very fortunate that Maryland has received over $800 million in eviction prevention assistance, and through unique programs like United Way's STEP funds, STEP program, and in addition to our property managers and residents communicating with each other and finding innovative solutions. We don't believe this is going to be a tsunami as expected, but there's definitely urgency in this problem that needs to be addressed sooner than later through innovative solutions. So our most vulnerable residents who are probably struggling prior to the pandemic and are even more vulnerable now can have the help that they need.
Great, thanks, Jesse. Angela, I'm gonna turn it over to you for a comment. What is your perspective? Are we gonna see a tsunami? What does the crisis look like? What's the scale of our current situation?
Sure. When I think about the scale, first thing that comes to my mind is rapidly growing. Specifically for Baltimore City, as a city that was already impacted significantly by concentrated poverty and economic disparity, what we're noticing is that residents who were already struggling, who were already financially unstable, are significantly impacted by the pending eviction crises. With a poverty rate of 21.8%, while the state's rate is 9.4%, then we know that we have a lot of work to do to address what can be potentially a tsunami. I'm not sure, Scott, to answer the question specifically if it's going to be a tsunami, but the fear for us is there. And so we're working diligently to prevent that as much as we can. We, like you talked about earlier, we are noticing significant applications who with 12 to 13 months arrears. We are paying out about $243,000 a week in back rent for residents in Baltimore City. And so we are noticing when we think about who's affected, of the 21.8% of residents living in poverty, 75% of those are Black or African American. 5 of those identify as Hispanic, and the majority of those households are female-led. And just like everywhere else across America, we're noticing that Black and Brown residents are the most impacted by this pending eviction prevention crisis. Of the back rent that we've paid out so far, 81.4% have been paid out to those who identify as African Americans, and 9% have identified as Hispanic. For another COVID response program that we're running, a prepaid cash program, 76% of those individuals who've taken advantage of that have identified as African American, and 17 have identified as Hispanic, with 20% identifying Spanish as their primary language. So we are, just like the rest of the country, noticing that the Black and Brown community are impacted most, and that our we're not yet seeing a downtick in the need for assistance. We are actually seeing an uptick.
Thanks, Angela. And one of the things that I think is different about the conversation today is that folks in positions of power have started to pay attention to equity. That the social movement that's swept across the country is having a direct policy impact in the way that we implement programs. And it's really great to hear you elevate those numbers and keep those in the spotlight, because that's something that that is urgently needed. And this is the Realities of Inequity series. And so it's very apt to identify how inequitable housing disparities are. The second question I have this afternoon, we'll start with Zafar. What has changed in the past 6 months? How has the crisis been evolving? For example, with regards to public policy or the system's ability to provide assistance?
Thanks, Scott. So I want to start off the answer to that question with another large number, which is 3,000. That's how many actual removals, actual evictions occurred in the past 6 months. When you go back to the end of CARES Act protection at the beginning of September. And that means we don't have in Maryland an actual eviction moratorium. That's why you've had so many households upended during this crisis time. So going to around October, November, we're looking at not just this number of evictions, but this pile-on of more eviction cases being filed in the courts. And at the same time, policymakers saying, so to speak, we're going to wait and see. Will the first Trump stimulus money help? Will the first tranche of Governor Hogan's eviction rental assistance money, will that help? And when you get into the fall and the court has to close again, you have an opportunity there to really reconfigure what is happening in the connection between rent delinquency, rental assistance, and the court procedure of eviction. In the legislative process that started in January and just ended this month, unfortunately, there was nothing done to address how that triangular relationship should work to make rental assistance effective during the pandemic. There were more than 24 good bills to protect renters. Not all of them were emergency legislation, but were sort of influenced by the realities of the pandemic. So an example of that would be protecting renters from eviction records that occurred during the pandemic. That type of bill did not pass. One of the most important bills was an emergency bill to close the loopholes in the eviction moratorium. That bill did not pass. There were great ideas, for instance, to require landlords to utilize rental assistance before they're eligible to file an eviction, thereby increasing the utility of this federal money. That was not adopted. So I think the real character of the last 6 months has been a missed opportunity at the policymaking level. There's been some success coming out of this legislative season. For instance, there was the idea to legislate a right to counsel for income eligible renters in an eviction case so that they have the benefit of legal representation. That bill resulted not in a right to counsel, but in a unfunded statewide program to provide increased access to counsel by 2025. So you see that we had ideas. I think everyone came prepared to talk about solutions to the inequity that had been identified during the pandemic. But when push came to shove, just not enough was done. And so what we're left with now is that we have to continue among nonprofit organizations, among local government, to try and rise to the challenge ahead of us without changes in the law, changes in the court procedure that would make something like the STEP program highly effective when tenants are summoned to court.
Yeah, and let me chime in there for a second, because I think it's important to understand why, for the listeners to understand why the moratorium is not that. You said it's sort of, we don't actually have an existing moratorium. So the CDC moratorium that we keep hearing gets extended at the federal level is interpreted by the local courts as a defense that you can raise if you have effectively activated it. So in order for the CDC moratorium to apply to your household, you have to fill out a form and submit it to your landlord, and you attest under penalty of perjury that you've done everything you can to pay the rent. But if you haven't submitted that form, the moratorium doesn't apply to you, and you can still be filed on for eviction and called to court. And it's then that you can raise this defense in court that you filed this form allowable by the CDC. But the vast majority of tenants don't show up to their court appointments. They don't understand that they had to file that document. It doesn't apply to all households. It has eligibility requirements. And there are other loopholes that are around this nationwide moratorium, so to speak, is what they call it, but it's not really. Like a landlord can not renew your lease as opposed to evicting you for failure to pay rent. And so that's what we call the tenant holding over loophole, the non-renewal of lease. And that's an even more dangerous shift, because if someone is being evicted for failure to pay rent, at the last second, they can pay to stay. But if a lease is not being renewed, there's kind of no way out. And so now tenants are sort of just being locked out and shut out. And that's a consequence of this sort of patchwork of moratoriums. And there's massive misinformation about this across the country. And here in Maryland, people don't understand the moratorium. They don't understand how to implement it in their household. They don't understand if it applies to them. And so consequently, households are being evicted. And as you said, the proof is in the pudding. 3,000 households have been evicted. Many more are on the way. The courts are reopening, and we need some common sense policy. Terry, I want to turn it over to you on this question. What's changed in the past 6 months, or if there's any part of what Zephyr said that you want to comment on? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a volatile 6 months, and I'm going to talk about it in 2 minutes. So we'll see how we do. I'm going to echo a lot of what Zephyr said, but I'll do it from the local government or even provider side. First of all, just to reiterate, courts reopened on March 15th. Baltimore County courts waited a few weeks before they started in on rent court so they could call out to try to get cases dismissed by the landlords if they had already been settled. So there were 54,000 backlogged filed failure to pay rent cases in Baltimore County before the courts shut down. Gives you an idea of the hill they have to climb to start moving through these. As providers, as local governments, we really have to be sensitive and flexible around understanding people waiting in lines for our programs right now. or waiting in lines with providers are going to come up with court summons, and they're going to come up with eviction notices. And has already been said, you have to take those court summonses seriously. There's no automatic moratorium where you don't have to go to court. And so putting lawyers in the courthouse, having referral lines to get legal assistance is going to become more and more timely and important. We also have to have side doors in our programs. If people have an eviction notice, just like pre-pandemic, they have to have a direct line to a provider that can address that eviction issue right then and there. As an aside, because I can't type as quick as Angela, but I see this question up in the chat, the notice of intent foreclosure portal at the state is still closed and is now, I understand, just been extended to July 1, which means at least at this point, we have to keep monitoring data around foreclosures, but people cannot file and cannot send out those notices of intent. But we have to be looking on the horizon for what's been building up in the system around homeownership and foreclosure. I also think it's important to note providers and local governments have been dealing with multiple funding sources. We have to continue to try to keep a lot of that complication on our side of the fence, meaning don't pass it on to potential applicants. At first, it was 3 months we could help. Then it was 6. Now we have ERAP, which is 12 months and maybe 3 months forward. It changes who can apply. I'm seeing lots in the chat about undocumented. Can we apply? If I have, here's the thing. We have to build our programs and run them so everyone can apply. And if there's an issue, we have to find a place to get you where you can get that help. Partnering with smaller local groups that have unrestricted money that's not even tied to COVID, we have to start talking to the churches. We have to start. I've seen neighborhoods taking up collections to help pay neighbors rent if it's an issue, and we have to all be talking to each other. And then finally, data is going to be key. We're starting to get a critical mass of people that applied. We need to know who is applying, who are we referring for help, who are we approving? And more importantly, I started with this number, who are we not? Who aren't we seeing in the list of people that are applying? At some point, I only partly joke, we need people with sandwich board signs outside of courthouses and other places saying, if you've got an issue with your rent or utilities, come talk to me, because we're going to miss people. And again, we have to keep removing barriers for applying for this money. And I'll talk later about connecting to services, which is going to become equally important based on all the volatility we're seeing. But Scott, here's the problem over the last 6 months. We don't have a lot of good data yet, and we don't know exactly what's coming, and we've got to be ready for the unknown because it's going to come here quick.
Great, thanks, Terry. And just to sort of recapitulate, so ERAP was an acronym that was thrown in there. ERAP stands for Emergency Rental Assistance Program, and that's the name of these new federal funds that are trickling down from the December stimulus bill that Trump signed, and then the March American Rescue Plan that Biden signed. Each one of those pieces of legislation put $25 billion with a B dollars into rental assistance, and that's each one. So the December is $25 billion, March is $25 billion. Combined, they'll put $800 million of rental assistance into the state of Maryland, and that's more money than has been available for rental assistance ever in the history of the country. And it's up to folks like some of the folks that are on this call to figure out how to move that quickly and efficiently. So I'm going to turn it over to Angela now. Angela, the courts are reopening, evictions are resuming, money's coming online. What do you expect in the next 2 to 3 months?
We are expecting an onslaught of additional applications. As I shared, that we have received in a short amount of time over 8,000 applications. We are definitely looking to see that increase. Just knowing that the impacts, the financial impacts are going to be long-term. Even as individuals get back to work, it's going to be very difficult for those who were already suffering financially to even have capacity to get caught up on 6 or 12 months of rent. So we're preparing for significant long-term financial impacts and the long-term need for eviction prevention. And so, so far we've paid back rent for 4,000 residents in the city. And as the courts reopen, we are looking for a significant uptick in that. We're preparing ourselves by expanding staff capacity, forging partnerships, and continuing to seek unrestricted money, as Terry talked about, so that we are able to assist a wider range of residents in the city. we are working to do prioritizations for those who have eviction notices so that we can prioritize them and get them in the queue as quickly as possible so that they won't experience eviction. We are utilizing first the most flexible of our dollars, which have been the CRF funding initially, and now the ERAP funding that you've talked about. And then we also have flexibility with the Affordable Housing Trust funds that we've received, which are completely unrestricted. So those are the things that we're doing and have done to prepare for the next 2 to 3 months, where we definitely expect to see a large volume, because what we know is that while people have thought that there was a moratorium, many people haven't applied yet. But as they understand more that they can be evicted, actually understand that the moratorium that they thought was there is lifting, then they will begin to apply as well. So we're definitely preparing ourselves for that.
Great, thanks so much for that. And so CRF, by the way, stands for Coronavirus Relief Funds, and that's the money that's tied to the CARES Act, and that is widely considered to be more flexible and dynamic than these new ERAP, Emergency Rental Assistance Funds, that are coming online. And, I should note that, as I think Terry and Angela both pointed out, all these funding streams have caveats and conditions tied to them and eligibility requirements. What's especially important in all of this is having flexible, in our context, charity and donation dollars that are unrestricted, that can fill the gaps and glue everything together. Because when you have big government money, it can be slow sometimes, and there can be red tape and blind spots. And it's those charity dollars, those donations that really make a difference and allow us to plug the gaps. So over to you, Zephyr. I wanted to ask this question again. What do you see in the near term, following up on what Angela said?
Well, I share a lot of her sentiment here. I think that there's a dangerous view of this, which is there's not that many tenants showing up to court. There's a lot of landlords dismissing cases because they were backlogged. That's going to change over the next 60 to 90 days, in my opinion. And of course, too, we're going to see more evictions being scheduled. And I just want to give an example of how I see this playing out more and more. On afternoon last Thursday, I was given a case, a woman who had been furloughed from work. She had luckily been able to get some pandemic unemployment with the help of her employer, but she did not know about the CDC declaration process. She didn't know that she was eligible for emergency rental assistance. And so when she called Public Justice Center on Thursday, she was calling about a pending actual eviction scheduled for this Monday. And so we had one business day to get her into the emergency rental assistance process so that she could then be eligible to use the CDC declaration, so that we could then send that to the landlord, so that we could then file a motion, emergency motion, to cancel the eviction and for a new trial, so that she could raise that CDC order as a defense to eviction. That all had to happen in one business day to avoid a certain eviction on a Monday. And that's the kind of thing I think that we're going to increasingly see, right? People just don't know about the protection. They don't know about the availability of these important funds. And yet the machinery, this court procedure, these actions are continuing. So the more litigation we see over the next month, 2, 3 months, I think the more serious challenge we have as service providers to be able to really just turn on a dime and make sure people are able to get assistance before the sheriff is executing a warrant. And just remember that once there is a judgment and an order for eviction, there's very little discretion that anyone has to raise these protections, as the sheriff is going out there to execute. And just one other point, Scott, if I may, we also have to keep in mind that it's not all about court-ordered evictions. Because of all that stress you saw in that video, the audio there, people are very susceptible to notices and threats and demands from their landlords, leading them to a mentality where they feel like there's just no hope at the end of this tunnel. They may as well self-evict, meaning they're just going to leave because they don't see any way forward. And so they're sort of evicting themselves before there's any court process. And we don't have any way to quantify that, but it's something we definitely are aware of from our clients.
Right. So some of the numbers that we're seeing are just the tip of the iceberg or don't tell the whole picture. And it's probably much worse if we were to have a fuller picture. Got it. All right, well, my last question before we open up to the audience, and this is a friendly reminder to the audience, please put your questions in the chat and we'll elevate those to get a panelist response. So my last question is, what needs to be done? Simply put, how are we going to get a handle on this overwhelming crisis? And Terry, I'll start with you on this one, and then I'll go back to Jesse for a response. Terry?
Sure. Well, I'll start out with a caveat that I think we're all working to figure this out. This has been uncharted territory, so we're trying things. And I think what has been interesting about the way governments approach this is we've had to throw everything we can at this as we go. And then we've had to learn, and it's all about how nimble we can be and working with our community partners and using data. I will say, I've never been on a panel where I've been so interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say, because we're learning from each other. I mean, this is where we're getting a lot of our information. I can't tell you the level of collaboration that's taken place between different jurisdictions. Angela, our teams, different surrounding counties, Jesse, her organization has been huge. People are talking to each other. And Zephyr, I know the scope of the problems we have, but there's people talking that never talked, and that hopefully is going to lead to something better than where we've been. As far as what we need to do, I think we need to continue emphasizing a menu of programs. You've heard a lot about STEP. Baltimore County is offering both a tenant direct portal where people can apply directly and then have their case referred to a nonprofit provider. And then you've got STEP, which is working with these larger landlords, trying to create equity. We're, getting into the weeds. We're developing a contracting system in the county where we can offer smaller nonprofits an opportunity to qualify to do eviction prevention. So in a way, it's like the App Store. If you're a small neighborhood organization who has the capacity to serve your community, you can apply to pull down some of this ERAP money to do that work for your population. We have to figure those things out. STEP has been a huge innovation, but it's a delivery mechanism, right? It's a way to get money out quickly, without judgment, without a lot of barriers. But at the same time, we have to remember that the problems were always much deeper, and they're still deeper. We every day we spend screening people for the COVID impact that led to their problem, but a lot of these issues are tied to things that were existing before COVID. So as we move through the pandemic, I talk to our health department colleagues and say, you had testing, you had vaccinations as this pinnacle. What we're here to do hasn't even hit yet. Our version of vaccination is really still coming. And we have to be very intentional, as I know a lot of jurisdictions are, about starting to connect the financial support to the deeper end. I've seen a lot of this in the chat. What if there's just no way you're going to be able to stay in your house? What if there has to be relocation, housing navigation? How can we provide everything from shelter, which has to be an option, to really quick shelter diversions and rapid rehousing? There's other funding out there that's not ERAP, that's tied to, particularly in our case, a lot of our HUD grants that need to be used in an innovative way. We really have to think about, and this is something our county executive has said from the beginning, how do we build systems that address the issues that predate the pandemic, that have been laid bare during the pandemic, so that they outlive the pandemic? We need to do better. We need to have quicker and more direct access to funding and deeper end supports. And we need to do this as a public-private partnership. So I just want to finish on this emphasis again. Our partnerships with the legal community, bringing in more providers who can do work in the courthouses, out on the streets through hotline referrals, and then linking the lawyers and other tenant advocates directly to the providers that have access to funding, and looking at it as a two-part piece, along with those deeper end supports as a continuum, is really going to be the success, because otherwise we're not going to be prepared for what's coming.
Great, thanks so much, Terry. And Jesse, what is your solution to the worst housing crisis in a century? You have 60 seconds, go.
Sure. Well, unprecedented crises call for unprecedented solutions. And I think this case is an example of the pandemic as ways that we found new ways to work together. We worked with United Way in Baltimore County to create an innovative eviction assistance program that addresses large amounts of delinquent rent coverage all at once to help lots of residents at the same time and reduce administrative burdens. So I look forward to all the innovative solutions that have already we've thought of. But I think that what needs to be done in this crisis is historically 98% of filings in court are because people can't afford to pay rent. So the fact that we have $800 million in eviction assistance right now, I think is a very promising opportunity. And if we can move that money efficiently, if we can get that money out into the hands of residents and property owners, we can prevent this eviction crisis. So again, going to Terry's point, anything we can do to reduce the administrative burden for those applying and those administering the programs. For example, with STEP, we had an innovative approach where we had residents just sign an affidavit proving they've been impacted by COVID, which was so much easier compared to some of the other documentation that was required. So again, anything to make the process easier and quicker, the more money that we can get out to residents, the faster, the better situation we will be in. And as Terry mentioned, I apologize for going off a little bit over my time, but this is such an exciting opportunity in time to have people who have worked together, who have never worked together before for new solutions. You know, the General Assembly session has ended, and unfortunately, we can't legislate our way out of this crisis right now. We need to be focusing on innovative programs and opportunities and identifying those residents who are being missed and where we can help those who still need it the most. So I look forward to the new opportunities presented at this situation as well.
Great, thanks, Jesse. Question from the audience. Zuffer, I'm going to start with you on this one. I've heard that most of the tenants have their jobs back, but still aren't paying rent because they can't be evicted. Is this true? And what can we do about it?
Well, I think we are seeing an increasing trend there with people returning to work. I can, just think of a woman I've represented twice since January in eviction proceedings. She had lost her job during the early part of the pandemic, and her employer rehired her, but hired her at minimum wage at 11 hours a week. So, I think that's the asterisk there to that thought that, folks are going to be fine. They're going to get back to work. But there's still restraints in the economy that heavily weigh on service workers and other low income earners. And so I don't think it's really a notion that should persuade anyone that we're not that emergency measures here are not necessary, and that the type of collaborations and innovations that we've talked about today aren't absolutely necessary.
Yeah, and I want to chime in on that too. I mean, I think it's many tenants are making a completely rational decision right now to stop paying their rent. A subset of folks are, and I worked with one woman recently who has been trying to make payments every month, has been trying to pay about $500 a month, but she still owes 3 months of rent, and we were going to be able to provide a month of rental assistance, and the landlord was going to evict anyways. And so the tenant said on the phone to me, why have I been paying all this time? What was the point of that? And she, and so her game plan going forward was that she was going to just withhold her money until she got evicted and then use that money to move elsewhere. And she's not alone. And she is going to say her example in her case to all the other folks in her apartment community is, I've been trying to make my payments and I was a fool to have done that because I'm going to get evicted anyways. And so that sentiment is bubbling up and emerging. And I think that, it's a troublesome problem. The next question I have, and I'll open this up to anyone who wants to reply, this will be our last question, is, quote, part of the problem with the CARES Act was that it put a lot of burdens on families to even be able to access assistance. How do we avoid that with these new federal funds? Anybody want to take a crack at that?
This is a good, funny answer, Scott. I saw that. It's funny that one, because I saw that question and I wrote back. I think it's an issue, and I don't think government in particular is always the best entity to come up with solutions to how we reach people that are hard to reach. One of the things we've done is split our programs between ones offered directly by Baltimore County government, ones we've done in larger partnerships with groups like yours, the United Way, and smaller programs in the community, Jewish Community Services, St. Francis Episcopal, and others, where people can walk in. They can do their own marketing within their community. But I think this has to be a broader conversation. I don't mean to punt the question, but I think we need to be hearing who's not accessing and get good things that we can incorporate advice from the community.
Yeah, that's great. And, I think another thing that I want to gloss on as we transition off here, sort of a closing thought, is that built into a lot of our policies and practices is this deserving and undeserving dichotomy, that there are certain folks that deserve assistance and certain folks that don't. A great example of folks who we often think deserve assistance is veterans, and folks who we often think as a society don't deserve assistance are folks with extensive criminal backgrounds or chemical dependencies and addiction challenges. And those biases and stereotypes have an insidious way of working their way into our policies and practices. And one of the ways that it's doing that currently is by not trusting tenants and saying that we have to review their bank account statements to make sure they're not making income. We have to get sworn affidavits to say that they meet these requirements. And we're going over tenants' personal financial records with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that they're not spending their money on alcohol or spending their money on cigarettes, and that they in fact don't have any money, and that's why they shouldn't have to pay the rent and are deserving of assistance. And folks are so worried about fraud that they're not actually able to get money out the door. And that deserving and undeserving dichotomy is an essential reason why money's not moving quickly, is we don't trust poor people to make informed decisions or to be paying the rent if they could. And so we want to we're having policies to make sure they can't pay the rent before we even decide they're worthy of assistance. And that's got to change. We've got to undo that stereotype. There's racial implications built into that stereotype. We have to start trusting that folks are experiencing hardship and get money moving. And that needs to be our primary goal. So with that, I'm going to transition it over to Franklin to take us away.
Thank you so much, Scott. And I want to thank our panelists for sharing their time and their expertise with us today. Lots and lots of questions. And all of you, I want to thank you for joining this session. If you have any questions for our speakers, their email addresses are on the slide. We'll also include them in our follow-up message back out to the folks who have participated. So please check your inbox for that information. As we heard today, there is lots and lots to be done to really begin to stem the tide of these evictions that are coming our way. You can help with a donation of any amount, doesn't matter the amount, to United Way's Housing Fund. And you can trust and believe that we'll use your gift, regardless of the amount, to provide what's needed, where it's needed, and to really work hard to keep our neighbors in their homes as best we can. So thank you all so very much for being with us today. Please enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to the next Realities of Inequity series coming. Thank you so much. Enjoy your day.
United we stand, united we are, united we can. United we can.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.